Hi, I'm Philip. I'm a front-end designer here at Sparkbox. Each year, we train our apprentices on the primary tools of the web: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. This lesson introduces CSS, along with the basic structures and concepts of the styling language. Join me as I cover topics such as the Cascade, Selectors, properties, and various examples of CSS at work.
Cool. So I'm going to try and go through things. I started putting together some slides, and some of the stuff's going to go over kind of high level, but then there's other things I'm going to jump on into CodePen and just demo out. So we'll see how it goes. Ask questions as we go, so on. I'm going to do my zoom in thing now, and then I'll get these slides up somewhere so that you all can reference them later. Okay, so CSS. First thing to know about CSS is the cascade. All right, it stands for Cascading Style Sheets. So what does that mean? So really the best way I think to think about the cascade is to think about that term, cascade, and whitewater rapids, right? If you're going to be, when you're working with CSS, it's basically like you're going down some rapids, and you kind of need to go with the current, right? If you start going up and paddling against the current, you're going to get tired, you're going to get worn out, and basically things are going to start falling apart. And really a lot of things with CSS are that way, and I think that's what a lot of developers tend to have problems with when it comes to CSS, is they look at it as something they should just be able to work with it as they do any other programming language, and don't think about that cascading nature. And what do we mean when we talk about the cascade? The cascade is that the file is read from top to bottom, and from top to bottom, both in the selectors themselves and the properties within those selector blocks, they are rendered out on the page. They are then overwritten as you go on down the page, and things with higher specificity, which we'll get into a little bit more later on, which is kind of our other aspect to CSS. You have the cascade and you have specificity. When you get into that specificity, you, as the word means, you're getting more specific. You're getting more honed in on what it is that you're trying to style, what element that you're trying to capture. Another way to kind of think about CSS is just a lot like a flowchart. You're just kind of following the path down to the element that you want, and you're trying to give the computer instructions to follow this flow path down to what it is that you want to style. And so we provide with selectors a number of different ways to get to that element. So selectors, these determine what HTML elements are styled in the DOM. Okay, this can happen, and specifically when I say the DOM, because this can happen after page render. So as soon as you trigger off some JavaScript to load in something, if it's already kind of there, the browser will handle that. And adding that in there. What you're dealing with then, we'll not get into too much specifics here, but there's things dealing with repaint issues and so on, what's going to trigger what when, but we can deal with some of those later on as we go on into it. So just a bit of an anatomy of a selector. It's pretty simple. I'm sure you all probably written some of this by this point, but if not, the selector is our main piece. This is what we're trying to find in the DOM. And then inside of a curly bracket, we have a list of properties with values. There are a lot of properties, and they all have a determined amount of values that go with those. And that is pretty much it. And then if I were to have, let's say I have the property of font size in this item. And if the first item was font size 16 pixels, but then the next property after that was font size 18 pixels, 18 pixels overrides the 16 because it's the next one on down in the list in the cascade. That all make sense? Cool. All right, so let's look at the different types of selectors. There are. The first one is the type selector, which is most commonly known as the element selector. This is where you're going to just take the name of the element that you want to style. Body, H1, header, section, article, a tag, so on, right? And then you just put in whatever values you want to have that style look like. Next after that is the ID selector. This is indicated by the pound sign, hash, octa-form, however you want to call that. It has many names. And then, again, whatever properties and values you want to have to go with that. Now, the thing about the ID selector, a couple of things. One, as hopefully you know, just with HTML, you should never have any more than one type of ID on the page. There should only ever be one. They are global values. They can actually be tied in with your JavaScript very quickly. It's a very interesting thing to HTML. It's kind of unique in a lot of ways. It also has a very high specificity. Once you start adding an ID, it's going to take a lot more other selectors to override that ID. Okay. Generally, you probably don't need to use these as well. But sometimes you don't have control over the HTML, and you have no other way to get to an element. The most common, by far, is the class selector. This is indicated by having a period or dot at the beginning of whatever the name is of that class. Classes, you can have multiple classes in a space-separated list in HTML. Yeah, by far what we use the most here at Sparkbox. Then we have one of my more favorite selectors, the attribute selector. The attribute selector allows you to select an element based off of what attributes are in the HTML element. So in this case, we're going to go for anything that has an href attribute. Most commonly, this is going to be an a tag, right? So if it has an href, it's going to get these styles applied to it. And why would you might want to do this sort of thing? So in some cases, you might have a CMS that is putting together something with an a tag. And let's say the a tag, nobody put it in an href. Or maybe they have an href that equals something specific. This is where the attribute selector is really interesting. The attribute selector has a lot more to it. So standard attribute has just a standard element. In this case, a tag has an href, it's going to apply those styles. However, maybe we want to style specific to a value. So we only want to get a tags that have an href value of example.com. So we're able to specify that specifically. So we can, maybe we have just a pound sign in there for the href. Fairly common when somebody's just developing something, just to put in a link to have on in there. We could go ahead and specify, oh, hey, there's a link, but it's not going anywhere. So if it equals pound, we're not going to style it, or we're going to style it in a special way that maybe we want to highlight. We want to go through as a debug mode, go through and highlight all of those in a red or a pink to say, oh, hey, make sure that you notice these are not going anywhere. If we want to get even more granular here, we can look to see if there is a www anywhere in that value. So even though it's here in its kind of standard spot, it's right in the middle though. It's going to get selected because it exists, right? We could have just even a slash in there and it would pick up on that, okay? Then we can also see if an attribute begins with a particular string. So in this case, we're looking to see that it's HTTPS. This could be really handy in a case that you want to indicate that a link is going to a secure server. So we could put HTTPS on each one of these and put maybe a little lock icon before each, right? We can go this a little bit further and see if it ends with a particular thing. So we want to make sure it's a .com. So maybe anything that is a .com, or maybe let's say it's a link going off to a PDF. That might even be a little more common. And you want, again, to have like an icon of a PDF next to the link. You can look to see if it's going to a .pdf by it ending with that value. We can also get into into space-separated lists. A class is pretty common. So if you're wanting to find a value anywhere within a space-separated list, like a class does, this essentially does the exact same thing as a period my class. This is just looking for my class somewhere in the list there. We could use this sort of thing in a data attribute as well. We have just a space-separated list of content that goes on in there. Or maybe you're even looking out for something that's part of an alt text. So if there's a name that whenever it pops up in alt text, you want to highlight that. You could use this type of selector to just see if that is in there in a space-separated list. And then lastly, and similarly, you can find a value within a dash separated list. So if we were to go through and let's say we're working on some type of product page for a clothing company and we want to have a listing of all the colors this particular product comes in, we could have just a dash separated list that goes through and shows those, and then we want to specify a particular style if that value is in that dash separated list. Okay. So if you want to learn more about attribute selectors, CSS Tricks has a very good breakdown on that. You can check that out, csstricks.com/attribute selector. All right. The one you really shouldn't ever use, but it's there for you, is the universal selector. It's the star selector. I know a lot of folks do use this, particularly for box sizing. That's the most common use for it. Here's the thing. When it comes to this, and the way CSS works, whenever you have something like this, the browser is going to go and apply it to every single element on the page. If you have a lot of elements, that's a lot of time for it to go through and apply that same thing on every single page. If you got a small site, you know, it's not going to be that big of a deal. It might be a nice little thing. But if you're working with a really large site with a lot of elements on the page, this can actually be a performance hit. And if you're dealing with something that has a lot of divs on a page, you're probably dealing with something that makes a good bit of money off of this, and every second counts. So, recommendation, avoid these. But they're there, so you can use them. Especially don't use these in some of the later situations that we'll be discussing. That's where it actually becomes a little harder. If it's just like this, as is, it's a little easier on the computer. It can be a little harder if you start grouping it with other things. Speaking of grouping, you can pull all these things together and do all kinds of different things with them. So we can take the type, the ID, the class, and the attribute and all put it together in a string to get ultra specific on a single element, right? So in this case, I have a spot where I'm specifying that it's an input element with a type attribute that is equal to email. And then I can apply the styles based strictly on that. Quite often you'll see something where somebody has put in the element name and then a class. Quite often that's not necessary. Getting this granular is not always something that you need to do. But particularly if you're working with attributes, it does make sense to need to do something like this. Not often with an attribute, you're wanting to get a little more specific than just what a type, ID, or class will accomplish. Any questions? Cool. Does this feel like things that most everybody knows, or is there still stuff being learned?
Stuff being learned. I didn't know about the different types, like the start equal and like the matching. I didn't know about that.
Cool. All right, now we're going to get into just kind of explaining a selector list. Again, you probably have seen this a lot. This is when you want to have the exact same styles applied to multiple elements. They're just a space or a comma separated list that will apply all of the styles to those elements. So in this case, all of our H1s, anything with an href attribute, and anything that has the class of my class will get the same styles. Combinators. This is where things really get kind of fascinating and interesting. This is where we can be more specific in trying to and provide relational situations to get to a selector. The most common is the descendant combinator, and this is just a space between these. So I have a my class inside of an H1 element. It's going to get to that. In all of these cases, the last element, the last selector listed is what is going to be applied. Okay. So when we go from the descendant combinator, we have then a child combinator. I've also known this to be called the direct descendant selector. So this is that there is a my class inside of an H1, but only directly. So the HTML has to be H1, and then somewhere inside that is a my class. But if there's another my class inside of a my class, that third my class will not get those styles. Okay. Adjacent sibling combinator, which is probably my favorite of all of these, is that these are two elements that are directly next to each other. So this class element is immediately preceded by the myClass element, and then the myClass element will get styles applied to it. Way that I use this the most often is with a list item, typically. So if I will have li plus li, and then I will apply the styles to the second li. And then if I have a list, what this allows me to do very quickly is to apply a specific style to everything but the first li, essentially. There are other ways to write that same thing. I just find this to be more fun. And then we have the general sibling combinator. Very similar. Instead of that plus sign between them, it's a tilde. And what this just says is that if there is a myClass anywhere at the same level within this parent, apply those styles to it. It does not have to be right next to it. So you could have, for example, a random paragraph element in between those two elements, and the styles would still be applied. But again, once you go down into another parent, these won't be applied anymore. Does that all make sense? Cool. All right, here's where things really get kind of fascinating. Pseudo classes. So pseudo classes indicate a state that your CSS or that your element might be in, and there are a lot of these. I'll have a link later to just be able to go view all those. And then after the pseudo elements or pseudo classes are the pseudo elements, and that's where I'm going to basically at this point I'm going to start jumping over and we'll start doing a little bit more like live coding things. Any questions at this point? Cool. All right. So I'm going to go through and just do some examples of some of my favorite pseudo classes. All right. So the first one here is the not pseudo class. And just to get some HTML on here, get an idea of something, let's, that is a lot smaller than I expected it to be up there. Let's zoom in. All right. Oops. There we go. So let's come up with some HTML. So let's just do a list, right? I was talking about a list. Item 1. And then 2. And close that up. Okay. So in the case of a not, let's add a class and just say, we'll call it second. All right. So now we can apply a style to li. And let's call that, we'll do a color red. And let's make our font size a lot bigger. Go ahead and make that 3 rem. Giant. There we go. Okay. But we don't want any LIs that have a class. All right. And let's go with specifically the class of second. So what we can do here is do li colon not. Oh, wrong thing. Not. And then parentheses. And inside these parentheses, we're going to state our condition that we do not want to be applied to. So I believe I need quotes in here. Second. And we will go ahead and change the color to blue. And then I'll find out, as I expected, that I did something wrong. And there we go. Okay. So to pull this on up and see this together, all LIs are being applied with the font size 3 rem and the color of red. And then everything that is not the second class is being applied color blue. Okay, we can get this a little bit more detailed, and we can put any kind of selector inside of this space, inside these parentheses. So we can specify it as a not class. So as long as an LI does not have a class, it will get these items applied. Another way to look at this and to think about this is the opposite of a grouping, right? Where this is actually going to flip this. Okay, so li, that attribute of class, gets this. The not specifies the opposite. Any questions on that? I love not. It's so much fun. All right. Next item, the empty pseudo class. This is very handy, specifically if you're working with a CMS and you don't know what somebody's going to be putting in as content. And let's say somebody goes through and doesn't really know that they've done this, but accidentally put in, hit return a lot. And because of that, they have a bunch of these empty paragraphs. I'm sure you may have seen this before. And then here's their text. Right? And so because of that, we got some space on up here. And we can probably go in and just to make sure that we're seeing all this really well, we can make a font size of 1.5 EM and then a margin of 1.5 EM 0. All right, so we now got some more space on up there. And actually, just so we can even see this a little bit better, instead of margin, I'm going to do padding. This is actually going to make it a lot bigger. Yeah, there we go. Okay. But we're like, okay, we want to make sure that we don't have this situation. We can do P empty. And then simply display none. All gone. Right? Nice and simple. Now, as soon as there's any content in here of any kind, even if it's just another element, it is going to render. Okay? So that is something to be aware of. But otherwise, you're able to use this pretty nicely. Oh, I didn't add a whole lot. I wonder if it's empty. Oh, is it really looking at classes altogether if there's any content whatsoever? That makes me happy. Yeah, that didn't change anything. Fantastic. So as soon as I put in a space or any content, there we go. All right. Makes sense? It's a fun one. There are a lot, as I've already said, of these. Now, probably the most complex one by far is Infinite Child. If you've ever worked with it, it is complex. It is a little hard to discern what all is going on there. All right, so let's go ahead and do the same thing where I've got all these paragraphs. That works out pretty well. Let's just go ahead and put TED. Okay. Text, more text, even more text, and what the heck more text. Okay. And we want to specify, we have no classes. Let's say maybe we're in a situation where we can't apply any classes. We don't have any control over the HTML, but we know that the HTML is going to be consistent. All right. And we want to specifically get, go ahead and bring this down in size, put that back to margin. All right, we specifically want to target this even more text. So what we can do is in child, and then 3. And then we can put a color, a blue on that, and even more text now is highlighted with our blue. We can get a little bit more interesting with this, and instead of 3, we can put a lot inside these parentheses. And there are a lot of good resources out there to kind of look into this. We can put even, and so now all the even, the second item, more text, and what the heck more text are now highlighted. Or we could do odd, of course, and that's going to flip that. I'm going to make this something a little bit more visible. There we go. Okay. We can also get a little fancy, and we could do something like 2n plus 1, right? And what that's going to end up doing is actually, it's probably going to be the exact same thing as odd, isn't it? Let's pick something a little different. This is where, let's do 4n plus 1. That should just pick So it's going to repeat of the fourth item plus 1. I can't even get into figuring out all the math that is going on into this, but there's a lot of ways you can handle this. So if you wanted to get every third as an example, we can put in 3 in. And if I put, as soon as I put in another item here, that's going to be highlighted, right? Because it is a multiple of 3. Okay, so we can get a little more crazy with this. With nth child, in a similar manner, there is first child, last child, as pseudo classes, but then you could also put in first or last in here, I do believe. There is also, instead of just child, there's of type, so it can look at a more granular way of seeing how many items there are. But this is, the nth child is the child of that parent, so we're looking at p tags that are an nth child in here. Here's where this will get a little crazy because of that nth child part. So if I put in a div in here, that's another child. And so that's actually going to set this off a little bit. You see how that works? So this is technically the 6th child still, but it's because that div got thrown in between it. The div, which I can put in here as another text, is kind of ruining things. So once I put in content in there, you can actually now count and see that. Okay? So that's where of type can come in. So we can put in of type, and that's actually going to shift this a little bit more. So now it's counting the p tag specifically instead of the children. Cool. So a lot of things that you can do with this. It can get certainly complex. Next up, and this one is a special case. This is the root pseudo class. So the root, whereas with all of your other pseudo classes, you're always going to have a selector, or almost always have a selector. Root does not have a selector whatsoever. Root is on its own. What root means is it's going to apply a style to the root-most element, the topmost element in the document, which is most likely going to be the HTML tag. But it can transcend and go beyond HTML as far as its specificity in this case. So instead of changing the font size here on the paragraph, I could actually change it here at the root. And that's going to maintain that. If you're going to be going through, even though we're not going to really get into these too much today, and use CSS custom properties, also known as variables, setting them first in the root for something that's going to be used multiple times can be done up here. So I can set red to blue, and up here in root, and then down here where we're using this, I'll use var red instead. Okay, and that's defined now by my root. Or I can change that to tomato, so this is still kind of visible. All right. So those are just our overview of pseudo element or pseudo classes. Full list you can get mdn.io/pseudo classes. It's a very exhaustive list by Mozilla. Next up are pseudo elements. Now, one thing I did not point out, but I will go ahead and show, is that a pseudo class is indicated by a single colon between the selector and whatever it is that your pseudo class is. A pseudo element is a double colon. That is the difference between these. Now, there are some older pseudo elements like before and after that will accept a single colon, but the proper way is a double colon. Okay? So before and after, just to kind of give an example here, if you're not familiar with these, I'm going to go ahead and slim this down to just our text here. And what an after requires, or a before, so let's go ahead and do a before here. And in both cases, they require content. If you're going to have anything display, you have to have the content property. And that content property could be blank, and then we can start doing something with this. Or I could say something like my paragraph so that's fun. And there we go. So my paragraph is there. Now, the thing about this is you're creating content on the page that is visible, and it is there, but it isn't selectable. So if I go to highlight this and copy it, all that I'm going to get is just that highlighted text. I'm not going to get the my paragraph and the colon there. So there's something to kind of be aware of. When it comes to using before and after, think of them as visual enhancements, visual things that you're going to be doing with the page, not as actual content. Okay. But we can get a little crazy and have a lot of fun with these when it comes to before and after, and this is typically how we're using them, where I might set display block height of 1 EM, width of 1 EM, and do a background color. And I'm going to have an element here now, just made out of CSS. So that's kind of a way that we'll typically use it. And you only get one before and one after per element, and they just get applied to either before, at the beginning of the element, or at the end of the element. They are considered inside of the element, so that is something to be mindful of when you're using these. Okay. The other things that we can do is specify something like a first letter or first line. This comes in really handy if you want to get into, let me go ahead and, let's say you've got a long string of text. Oh, I don't have my thing installed. Form some blah, blah, blah. And we want to target this with the first letter. My first letter is now going to have a background color. Let's change that to color of red to make that a bit bigger and make that margin a little bit more easy to see. Right, and let's bump that up to, 15 is going to be huge. All right, so we're specifically targeting the very first letter in this element. Okay, and then this means that any paragraph I have, that first letter is going to be highlighted. All right. Now, if we had a really long line of text that was wrapping, right, as you would with a typical paragraph, and really what you're probably going to want to do with something like this is, let's say it's only going to be the first paragraph of your content. So you can string these together with a pseudo class and a pseudo element. So first child, first letter. That says fist, not first. Right? And so now my second paragraph is not going to get that style applied. Okay? So we can string these together, get more granular in our selection, and come up with some really interesting effects. So I could even go to the extent of, yes, I've got it larger, but let's go ahead and make our font size bigger and make that 2 EM. So this is going to be 2 EM of our 2 EM. So now we've got a larger first letter. We could do some additional things to make it fit in there a little bit better and do some wrapping. We could even just do I think I can do all this. Let's see. Float left. Yeah, there we go. So now we've got this wrapping, right? And it kind of comes across with a cool effect. We could do some interesting things. Let's say we make the color white and do a background color of black. And now we're going to have a reverse out of our first letter there. We can make that a display block and put in padding of 0.25 EM, right? And so we can have a lot more fun here. Back margin right, 0.5 EM. Some more space around there. So you can combine these, start really working in some really interesting ways to work with this styling and getting specificity to their element, right? Let's see what else I have in here. Oh, placeholder. So this is another one I find that I try to use pretty often. So to kind of show this, I'll just delete all this. And I'm going to put in an input field with a placeholder. Why this is the case for most situations, I don't know. So I'm going to set that up as a type text. All right, so there's my input field. Let's just set up the input and make that a font size just so we can see this a little bit better. The rim, that'll be a lot bigger. But that color is inaccessible. The default coloring for a placeholder is, you can't see that. If you have any level of visual impairment that would have you needing to use assist tools, change the contrast, and so on. So placeholder pseudo element allows us to adjust that. So I can now change this color to be something that's a little bit darker. Now, the thing with this, while that works and I can put in black, the one thing you need to be aware of is that as soon as I go in and click and start typing, it goes away. And so you want to make sure that it's distinctively different than whatever the type is that you're going to be putting in. So we're going to set the color here to black, and then instead set this to a darker gray, but something that's a little bit more legible. So let's put this at 999, for example. So a little darker than our default, maybe not as visible on this TV, so maybe let's make that a little bit darker. Let's go for 5s then. All right, much darker, but as soon as I come in here and start typing, it's even darker. Okay, so some things to kind of consider. These are design things, design considerations, and user experience considerations. Okay. So, full list of pseudo elements at mdm.io/pseudo elements. You can get going through and see what all you can target there. So, properties. We've already kind of started going into these. And honestly, I think it's where you get to have the most fun. This is where you're actually applying styles, right? All up to this point, we've just been talking and how we're doing on time. Seems like we're okay. When does this go till 10? Okay. I have 15 minutes. All right. So properties, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of depth here because there are a lot of properties. Okay. This is where I'll probably, you've already seen me type up a few. I want to go over some things to think about and know about when it comes to properties. And then just go mdm.io, still a really great resource for this, and just see the list of different properties that exist. So the first thing I do want to go over is shorthand. And actually, I think I have this slide in here twice. I do, because I forgot to delete one of these. Oh well. So shorthand, when it comes to writing CSS, all right, we have different ways that we can write something. So let's put in a different example here. I'm just going to make a div. Let's type in, let's do apprenticeship. Need lots of exclamation points. And so in this div, we could set margin left to be 2em, right? And so it's going to bump over towards the right because we're putting our margin on the left. I could go ahead and put font size on up here, and we'll set this to 2em as well. But typically, whenever you're seeing a dash in here, it usually means that there's a shorthand, okay? And you probably have seen this with margin. So if I had set margin instead, it's now going to set 2em to all sides. Now the way margin and padding work is it is in this order: top, right, bottom, left. So if we just wanted to get the top and bottom, we can put 2em 0, and that's now going to pull that on in. This repeats to be 2em 0, 2em 0. And if we wanted to just get the top and the left, we can do 2em 0, 0, 3em. So now I have a margin just on the top of 2em and to the left of 3em. And if we wanted to go in here and look at our dev tools, and we highlight that element, we're going to see that with that orange space there. That is our margin. Okay. We can go even in more detail here with background. So background, there's background dash image, background dash color. And whenever you're using it and you're only wanting to get to one thing, use the longer form. So if all you want to change is the background of something, use background dash color, not background color. This is more of a best practice. But it's because when it comes to this, we're dealing with specificities. All right. When we are dealing with the background, that has a higher level of specificity in the property itself to be more subjective to what things are going to happen there. So if I have up here, let me go. All right, background, and let's say I've got a good way to do this. No, background's a bad way to do this because I need an image and I don't have an image on me to work with. So let's do margin, and I'm going to set margin to EM here. But then I'm going to set margin 3EM 0. Right? All I wanted to really do was just change, and maybe I even set it to auto. All right. But all I wanted to do was change the top and the bottom. I didn't want to affect all of the two EMs. This is where, and here's the thing, like I'm doing this all on the same element, but here's the thing about CSS, and one of the big things to remember is you can have multiple selectors going all over the place that are all attacking the exact same element, right? This is where we want to try and be specific in our class usage so that we know with certainty what we're trying to track down, okay? If we have a number of selectors that are out there that are an element selector, we're going to get those applied all over the place. And then we may be fighting ourselves on that. So this is kind of a situation where if we're running into this, it's usually a sign that there's an issue elsewhere, right? And maybe I need to be looking for some other CSS that needs to be refactored and cleaned up. I'm kind of going on a bit of a tangent off of what I meant to go on to, but this is kind of something to point out. So if all I wanted to do was change the top, this is where we're starting getting into BEM, right? This is where BEM really makes sense. So I could have a class of, let's call this title, and then title top, dash dash. This is the modifier. I can now put on here dot title, and then dot title dash dash top, right? And that is more specific. Does that make sense? I know that I didn't get here in a good way, but now that we're here, does that make sense? Okay. So we don't want to override all of those other styles by just declaring margin again, because then what we're doing is margin, and then we're repeating ourselves a lot. We got to now write this in a shorthand form, to rem, right? And so this is what this is doing is it's doing the exact same thing, but now we're overriding ourselves, and we're putting a little bit more task to the browser when we can keep it shorter by writing it out in a long form. Okay. So just kind of some things to think about when it comes to writing your properties, and to try and keep this as simple as possible. And I'm sure you've heard me say it many times already, but refactoring is going to be a big part of doing any work in CSS. You're going to go through, you're going to see how something works, and you're like, it's not quite right, it doesn't quite fit, so I'm going to adjust it a little bit. And again, with CSS and HTML, there are a lot of paths that are right and that are okay. There are some, in some cases, that are better and have more of a best practice, but you're still getting to the same thing. But being aware of how the browser works, what kind of pressure you're putting on it are things to be considerate of. Okay, then let me see what I've got in here. All right, vendor prefixes. So these are special things when it comes to CSS. Now, these are not nearly as necessary as they used to be. This was more prevalent about 5 years or so ago, but in the last several years, a lot of the browser manufacturers have been working towards eliminating them, in large part because of the at rules that we'll be discussing a little later. But as an example, and one that actually I'm using right now on a project is something called backdrop filter. So backdrop filter is like filter. So you can, if you're familiar with filter, you can pass all kinds of interesting things to it. So I'm going to just do a backdrop filter. I'm going to set this to blur 10 pixels. So whatever is behind that element is going to get blurred. So one thing I could do here is if I go out and if I find a, let me go find, there we go, Lorem Pixum. All right, I can just grab an image that I'm going to set as my background image on this. And so let's set body, background, image, URL, oops, this. And that's just going to repeat. And as you can see back here, let me make this a little bit bigger. Font size 2 EM and padding 1 EM. Oh, that's not a good picture. There we go. All right, so you can see how that's blurry now behind this particular element. Well, one thing that we need to do is that, and actually, let's go turn this off. So one of my default settings that I have in CodePen is to turn on auto prefixer. So it's going ahead and adding the prefixes for me. So I'm going to turn that off, save that, and now it's not working anymore. All right, I don't have this working. Now, if I open this up in Chrome, it would work just fine. Chrome does not require a vendor prefix. I had this open up in Safari. Safari requires a vendor prefix still for backdrop filter. So when it comes to doing that, we need to write out the exact same property again, but in this time, we're going to add the WebKit prefix. There are a number of vendor prefixes. They're all dependent on that vendor. WebKit, this is where you start getting into the history of browsers. WebKit is what Apple developed for Safari, which was based off of something else before it. Chrome used WebKit, so you will still, if you come across an instance of Chrome needing a vendor prefix, it will be WebKit as well. But then Chrome forked WebKit and created Blink, and that's what their rendering engine is now called, but any vendor prefixes, they still use WebKit. And then there's Mozilla, and they use the prefix of Moz, M-O-Z. Microsoft uses, for older versions of Internet Explorer, if there's a vendor prefix need, they use -ms or MS, so -ms dash. And then the last one is Opera. So, and this is only going to be in the cases before they adopted Blink. Oh my gosh, the history here. And that is just O. So those are your different ones. I think there might be another couple out there, but those are your basic. WebKit is going to be the one that you use, pretty much. Rarely will you need to use Moz. Here's the thing that gets interesting too. This prefix isn't limited to properties. It can also be on pseudo elements and pseudo classes. You'll usually see these marked as experimental if you're looking at them in MDN. Okay. So in some cases, as an example, the placeholder or the selector pseudo element before they had wide adoption had these. And that's the general idea behind these. This is where the browser vendors are trying to come up with something, or maybe it's something that's in an early draft with the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, and it hasn't been officially stated that this is what we're going to do. And so a vendor prefix would be in there as a way to start edging it along, so developers like us can start using these things before they're finalized. Okay.
So in this case, We want the prefix property to come before the...
Thank you for pointing that out. Yes, exactly. I was too busy just typing this out. So that's a very good point that Luis just made. When it comes to using a vendor prefix, you want to think about them in terms of the cascade. And so the vendor prefix should come before the backdrop filter. And the reason for this, and I think I just used this exact example with you the other day, Luis, is that if I pull this down here, and let's say I'm on a version of Safari that supports just plain backdrop filter without the vendor prefix. Well, it's still going to need to have support for the vendor prefix version so that it knows what to do with it. So that older browsers can still, or older websites that have not updated can still have that applied. Well, in this case, I want my backdrop filter to be 20 pixels, but I forgot about the vendor prefix, and that's set to 10 pixels. So when I go on Safari, it is 10 pixels and not 20. Whereas once I flip this around and put that in, it will now be the 20. It's not going to be in this case just because I have auto prefixer turned off, but that's the general idea. This actually would be the case if I opened this up in Chrome and had that flipped around. That would be the situation, assuming that Chrome implemented with the WebKit vendor prefix. Okay, does that make sense? All right. At rules. Okay. So I'm going to get into these. Let's see what all we got in here. I got examples. Fantastic. Most common at rules. So at rules, just as a general thing, got 1 minute to explain at rules, so that's cool. I never run over on these things ever. So when it comes to the at rules, these are special situations that you're looking out for. This isn't. It's not always that. But in the case of media queries and selector queries or feature queries, you're looking at finding out information about the browser and then applying styles based off that. So in this case, I'm looking that the min width of this browser is 30 rem. What does that, if we were to put this another way, maybe we're looking for a min width of 800 pixels. So the browser is no bigger than 800 pixels wide. Then we're going to apply whatever styles are on in there, or I should say no shorter than 800 pixels in the case of a min width. So whatever, as soon as the browser is 800 pixels wide, it's going to start applying whatever styles and selectors we have inside that at media query. Make sense? Probably have written some of these already. Okay. One you may not have is a feature query. This is what's called at supports. This is a newer thing. Newer browsers support this. Older browsers, what's cool about these is they just ignore it. They have no idea what it is, so they don't even bother doing anything of what you do in here. So where this comes in handy is, let's say you have an older browser that supports at supports, but has not supported grid yet. We can now use at supports display grid to narrow that down and only apply specific styles when a browser supports display grid. Things that might come in handy for this sort of thing is if you're creating a grid system that's using Flexbox. When you're doing that, you're going to want to set all of the items. Let's say it's going to be a 4-column grid. You're going to set all those items to have a width of 25%. That way they're all lined up with each other for 4 columns wide. When it comes to grid does not use that type of approach of using the width. So instead, if you use grid and you set it to be a 4-column grid, what you're going to have with that width of 25% is the elements of the grid are only going to be taking up a quarter of their quarter, right? Does that make sense? Basically, it's going to be a 16th wide, and then there's going to be all this space, and then another bit of column of information. So the at supports, you want to get rid of that, and you want to put in width auto. Okay, I could jump over and do an example if that would help explain it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So let's make a really quick grid here. So let's make it a div class grid, and then we'll do div class grid item. All right, and then let's just get rid of all that. So our grid is going to be, let's go ahead and we're going to set this up as a flex box, right? So display flex. All right. Let me go ahead and get our grid item on here so we can see that. We'll go ahead and just make it, since it's a div, we'll make it something that we can see. So a height of, say, 10 EM and a width. Oh, let's not set a width yet because we're doing flexbox. Background color red. So now we should see a big line of red. And then just to make sure that we've got some space around each one of these, we'll do a margin. Oh wait, that's all grid. Oops, grid dash item. That shouldn't change anything. And then margin 0.5. Okay. So now we're going to get everything looking wrong. So that's cool. Background color, grid, item. There we go. Okay. So now we've got a 4-column grid. We're just using Flexbox to create this. But we want to go ahead and apply grid. So here's what's cool, what we can do. The general idea of the Cascade and when you actually need to use that supports is the Cascade is working here for me where the browser understands Flex and then it's like, oh, you want grid, I can apply grid. Browsers that don't support grid are going to read Flex and stop. Okay, that's very handy for us, so we can just apply these sort of things. So we don't actually need add supports at this moment. I can keep on going on down and do grid column, grid column, no, grid template column. There we go. All right, and I'm going to set this up as a 4-column grid. So just as a quick way to do this, we can explain all this later. 1FR, 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 that just means equally set this up into 4 columns. But now we're dealing with that 25%, okay, of that width. So we only have, this is only taking up 25% of its allotted grid space, okay? So this is where we want to go ahead and get rid of that. So at supports, and we're going to look for supporting display grid. We could put in anything in here, but specifically working for grid in this case because that makes the most sense. And we're going to just set our width to auto. And as soon as I do that, it's now going to fill out that space. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah, that's cool.
So we can do a lot more with this, you know, and look for different scenarios. Just allows you to be more specific and create more situations that you want particular styles to be applied. Okay. And then going from that, we have keyframe as another at rule that you probably use pretty regularly. So keyframes are when you're wanting to do some type of animation. In this case, I'm doing a very simple animation of going from an opacity of 0 to an opacity of 1. The other thing instead of from and to is that you can have percentages in here and do something at 10% and 20%. And that percent is of the time down here when you call that. So another way of looking at this instead of the words of from and to would be 0% and 100%. And so in the course of this half a second, it's going to go from that 0 to 100%. If I wanted to have something happen at 50% mark, that would happen in this case at a quarter of a second, right? And so when you're calling this animation, we're giving the name of the animation. That's what's happening up here. At keyframes declares that I'm creating a keyframe. Fade in is the name of the keyframe. You can name this whatever you want. And then in animation, I'm providing that name, the length of time, and then the type of transition. So how do we want this to appear? And that's ease. One quick thing I will show you as a resource is there's these named things of ease, linear, ease in, ease out. There's also something called cubic Bezier. A cubic Bezier, I forget what the name of that website is. We will find it very quickly, I assume. There it is. Maybe. There we go. Okay. So this shows you the animation path that the timeline is going to follow. And we can adjust this with a cubic Bezier to be more specific. We could just select the linear or an ease in, ease out, so on. But as soon as I hit go, you're going to see how this works. And you can see the blue is showing you what one of the named items does. The pink shows you what your cubic Bezier is doing. All right? And you can see how that works a little different. They get to the end at the exact same time, but their path is a little different. What's really cool with this, so you pull this on out, you can actually cause it to overshoot and then come back. So there's some neat things you can do there with refining your animation. I don't know if I have much else after that. So that is largely all I'm going to cover for today. There's definitely a lot more to explore. This is just a water hose of the basics that exist out there. There's more to it, obviously. So any questions in all of that? No? Cool. All right.